Some secrets are buried so deep, you think they'll stay hidden forever. But the earth has a way of giving up what was never meant to stay buried. Abram Cole thought he knew every sound his mountain made, the way the wind talked through the pines, how the rocks settled in the cold. But when that ancient tree fell on a calm spring morning, no storm in sight, something felt wrong. His dog Rye found it first, howling like his heart was breaking. Inside the hollow trunk, Abram discovered things that shouldn't exist. A child's boots, a locket with his sister's name, bones that had been hidden for decades, and carved into the wood, a message that connected his family to a tragedy he never knew happened. How do you find peace when the past refuses to stay buried? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Abram Cole had been living on Cole Mountain for 37 years, ever since he'd inherited the cabin and the surrounding 100 acres from his grandfather. The old man had built the place with his own hands back in 1923, choosing a spot where the morning sun would warm the front porch and the evening shadows would fall just right across the vegetable garden. It was the kind of place where a man could think, where the silence wasn't empty, but full of the small conversations between wind and leaf. Between creek water and stone, the cabin sat in a natural clearing about halfway up the mountain's eastern face, surrounded by towering pines that had stood there long before any Cole had ever set foot on the land. From his front steps, Abram could see clear across the valley to the distant peaks, their snow-capped summits catching the first light of dawn and holding it like a promise. On clear days, he could make out the thin ribbon of smoke rising from the chimney of the Henley place. 15 miles down the mountain, the closest neighbors he had, Rye, had come to him 3 winters ago. A half-starved pup someone had abandoned on the old logging road that wound up from the valley. The dog was part German shepherd, part something wilder, maybe wolf, maybe just the kind of mix that happened when domestic dogs went feral and learned to survive on their own terms. He'd shown up on Abram's porch during a blizzard that had lasted 4 days, and by the time the snow stopped falling, they'd both understood that neither of them was meant to be alone. The dog had an unusual intelligence, the kind that made Abram wonder sometimes if Rye understood more than he let on. He'd learned the routines of the mountain quickly, when to stay close during hunting season, when the weather was about to turn, which trails were safe and which ones led to drop-offs that could kill a man if he wasn't paying attention. More than once, Rye had guided Abram home through fog so thick he couldn't see his own boots. This particular morning had started like most others. Abram woke before dawn, as was his habit, and put coffee on the wood stove that served as both heater and kitchen range. The routine never varied much. Coffee first, then a walk around the property to check for damage from the night's wind or any signs that the local wildlife had been testing his fences. Rye always accompanied these morning rounds, ranging out ahead, but never so far that he couldn't hear Abram's whistle. The spring had come early this year. By the second week of April, most of the snow had melted, except for the patches that lingered in the deepest shadows. The creek that ran along the northern edge of his property was running high and fast with snowmelt, carrying the rich scent of thawed earth and new growth. Wildflowers were already pushing up through the forest floor, trillium and bloodroot, and the delicate yellow blooms of glacier lilies. Abram had been checking the creek level when he heard the crack. It wasn't the sharp report of a branch breaking under wind or weight, but something deeper, more fundamental. The sound of wood that had stood for centuries finally surrendering to forces it could no longer resist. He turned toward the sound just in time to see the massive pine tilt slowly, almost gracefully. Before gravity claimed it, the tree had stood on a slight rise about 200 yards from the cabin, one of the giants that had been there since before his grandfather's time. Abram had always thought of it as a landmark, a fixed point in his personal geography. He'd used it to orient himself during whiteout conditions, and on summer evenings, he'd sometimes sit on the fallen log nearby and watch the sunset paint the far mountains in shades of gold and purple. But there had been no wind that morning, No storm clouds building on the horizon. The air had been still and clear, with that peculiar quality that mountain air has in spring when the last of winter's chill is finally loosening its grip. The tree's fall made no sense, and as Abram jogged toward the sound, he felt an uneasiness that had nothing to do with the loss of an old friend. Rai had reached the tree first, circling the massive trunk with his nose to the ground, reading whatever story the scents told him. But when Abram arrived, the dog had stopped his investigation and was sitting perfectly still, about 10 feet from the base of the fallen giant. His head was tilted back, and from deep in his chest came a sound Abram had never heard before, a low, mournful howl that seemed to contain all the sadness in the world. The tree had broken off about 6 feet from the ground, leaving a jagged stump that revealed the hollow interior that had been hidden for decades. The trunk itself had split open when it hit the earth, and from where Abram stood, he could see that the hollow extended deep into the tree's heartwood. Ancient pines sometimes developed these cavities as they aged, spaces where the inner wood had rotted away, while the outer bark and sapwood remained strong enough to keep the tree alive and standing. What caught his attention first was the smell, not the fresh scent of pine sap and broken wood that he'd expected, but something else, something that spoke of long years and secrets kept in darkness. It was a musty, complex odor that made him think of old books and forgotten attics, of things that had been waiting in silence for someone to find them. Abram approached the hollow slowly, and as he got closer, he could see that the cavity was larger than it had appeared from a distance. The opening was about 3 feet wide at the base, tapering as it went up into what had been the tree's trunk. And there, scattered in the dark space where no light had penetrated for decades, were things that should not have been there. The child's boots were small, made of leather that had darkened with age, but had been protected from the elements by the tree's embrace. They were the kind children wore in the early part of the century, high-topped and sturdy, designed for hard wear rather than fashion. One boot had fallen on its side, and Abram could see that the leather laces were still threaded through the eyelets, tied in the careful knots that spoke of a parent's loving attention. Beside the boots lay a locket, tarnished silver, that caught what little light filtered into the hollow. Even from where he stood, Abram could make out the delicate engraving on its surface, flowers and vines worked into a pattern that had been popular when his grandmother was young. The chain was broken, and several links lay scattered near the locket like breadcrumbs leading nowhere. But it was the third discovery that made his breath catch in his throat. Partly buried under what looked like the remains of a small blanket, he could see the unmistakable curve of human bones. Small bones, child-sized, yellowed with age, but preserved by the tree's protection from weather and scavengers, and carved into the inner wall of the hollow. Barely visible in the dim light were words scratched into the wood with what might have been a knife or nail. The letters were crude and hurried, as if whoever had made them had been working in desperate haste. As Abram's eyes adjusted to the darkness, he could make out part of the message: "Cole family knows the truth." His hands were shaking as he reached for the locket, and when he finally managed to work the catch open, his worst fears were confirmed. Inside, protected by the silver case, was a small photograph of a young girl with dark hair and serious eyes. Written in fading ink on the back of the photograph, in handwriting he recognized from old family letters, were the words, "Sarah Cole, age 7, 1889. Abram sat back on his heels, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. Sarah Cole had been his great-aunt, his grandfather's younger sister. According to family history, she had died of fever when she was 7 years old and was buried in the small family cemetery on the far side of the mountain. He had visited her grave many times over the years, had even placed wildflowers on the simple headstone that bore her name and dates. But if Sarah was buried in the family cemetery, what were her belongings doing inside this tree? And whose bones lay beside them in the hollow darkness? Rai had stopped howling, but he remained sitting in the same spot, his eyes fixed on Abram with an intensity that seemed almost human. It was as if the dog understood that something fundamental had changed, that the discovery in the tree was more than just old artifacts hidden away by time and circumstance. As Abram continued to examine the hollow, he found more evidence that someone had deliberately placed these items inside the tree. The bones had been carefully arranged, not scattered as they would have been if animals had been involved. The boots had been placed side by side, as if their small owner had just stepped out of them. And the blanket, though deteriorated, showed signs of having been folded before being placed over the remains. This wasn't a hiding place chosen at random. Someone had selected this tree specifically, had somehow known about the hollow in its heart. They had climbed up to the opening, had arranged these things with care and purpose, and then had carved that message into the wood. But why? And what truth were they trying to preserve or expose? The morning sun had climbed higher while Abram knelt beside the fallen tree, and now it slanted through the forest canopy in long golden shafts that illuminated the scene with an almost ethereal quality. The discovery that had seemed so dark and mysterious in the early light now appeared almost peaceful, as if the tree had finally been able to release a burden it had carried for more than a century. But peace was the last thing Abram felt as he carefully gathered the artifacts and prepared to carry them back to the cabin. The locket, the photograph, the small boots, each item raised questions that had no easy answers. And underlying all of those questions was a deeper unease, a sense that his family's history was not what he had always believed it to be. As he walked back toward the cabin with Rye at his side, Abram found himself thinking about his grandfather, who had died when Abram was still a teenager. The old man had been a storyteller, full of tales about the early days on the mountain, about the challenges of building a life in such an isolated place. But he had never spoken much about his sister Sarah, except to say that losing her had been the greatest tragedy of his childhood. Now, with the evidence of the tree's secret weighing heavy in his hands, Abram wondered what other truths his grandfather might have taken to his grave. Back at the cabin, Abram spread the artifacts on his kitchen table and studied them under the bright light of the window. The photograph in the locket was clearer now, and there was no mistaking the family resemblance. Sarah Cole had the same dark eyes and stubborn jawline that ran through the Cole bloodline, the same serious expression that Abram recognized from old family portraits hanging on his walls, but it was the handwriting on the back of the photograph that troubled him most. He pulled out a wooden box from under his bed where he kept family documents, letters, deeds, and other papers that his grandfather had left him. Among them were several letters written by his great-grandfather, Samuel Cole, Sarah's father. The handwriting was identical. Samuel Cole had written Sarah's name and age on that photograph. But according to every family story Abram had ever heard, Samuel had watched his daughter die of fever and had buried her with his own hands in 1889. The grave marker was still there, weathered but readable, on the hill behind the cabin. Abram set the photograph aside and examined the small boots more carefully. They were well made, expensive for the time period, with intricate stitching along the seams. The leather was supple despite its age, suggesting it had been treated with care before being placed in the tree. Inside one boot, barely visible, were initials carved into the leather sole. S.C. The locket itself was a puzzle too. It was clearly valuable, made of solid silver with delicate engraving work that would have cost a family like the Coles a significant sum. The chain had been broken violently, not worn through with age, but snapped as if it had been torn from someone's neck. One end of the chain showed scratches that looked like teeth marks. As the afternoon wore on, Abram found himself returning again and again to the message carved inside the tree. Cole family knows the truth. The words were roughly carved, but deliberate, and they had been cut deep enough into the wood to survive decades of growth and weather. Whoever had left that message had wanted it to be found eventually. But what truth? And why hide it inside a tree that might not fall for another century? The answer came to him gradually as he sat on his porch that evening, watching the sun set over the distant peaks. Rye lay at his feet, still unusually quiet since their discovery that morning. The dog's behavior had been strange all day. He'd refused his food and had spent most of the afternoon sitting beside the table where the artifacts lay. As if standing guard over them, Abram's grandfather had been 11 years old when Sarah died. Old enough to remember clearly, old enough to understand what was happening around him. But in all the stories he'd told about growing up on the mountain, he'd never once described Sarah's final illness or her burial. He'd spoken of her as if she'd simply vanished from his life, leaving behind only sadness and silence. That night, Abram went through every document in the family box, looking for any mention of Sarah's death. What he found was telling in its absence. There were letters from Samuel Cole to relatives in town, discussing the weather and the challenges of mountain life. There were receipts for supplies and records of timber sales. But nowhere was there any mention of a funeral, a grave marker, or even a doctor's visit during the supposed illness. It was as if Sarah Cole had simply ceased to exist in the family records after 1889. The next morning, Abram made the hour-long hike to the family cemetery on the far side of the mountain. He'd been there countless times over the years, tending the graves and keeping the small plot clear of undergrowth. The cemetery held 5 generations of Coles, from his great-great-grandfather, who'd first settled the land to his own parents, who died in a car accident when Abram was 25. Sarah's grave was in the oldest section, a simple headstone marked with her name and dates. Sarah Elizabeth Cole, 1882-1889, beloved daughter. The stone was worn but intact. Surrounded by the taller markers of her parents and older siblings, Abram knelt beside the grave and began digging with the small shovel he'd brought from the cabin. The earth was soft from recent rains, and it didn't take long to reach the depth where a child's coffin would have been buried. What he found instead was empty earth and 6 feet down, the natural bedrock of the mountain. There was no coffin, no remains, no evidence that anyone had ever been buried in this spot. Sarah Cole's grave was empty. It had always been empty. Sitting back on his heels beside the false grave, Abram felt the full weight of the deception that had shaped his family's history. Someone had gone to great lengths to create the illusion that Sarah had died and been properly buried. They'd carved a headstone, dug a grave, and created a story that had been passed down through 4 generations. But they'd also preserved the truth inside the hollow tree, along with evidence that told a very different story. The broken locket chain with its teeth marks, the carefully preserved boots and photograph, the bones of a child who had died under circumstances violent enough to require such an elaborate cover-up. As Abram filled in the hole he'd dug, his hands shaking with the magnitude of what he'd discovered, one terrible possibility began to take shape in his mind. What if Sarah Cole hadn't died of fever? What if she'd been killed? And what if someone in his own family had been responsible? The message in the tree suddenly took on a darker meaning. Cole family knows the truth, not a revelation but an accusation. Someone had discovered what happened to Sarah, had found evidence of her real fate, and had hidden it where they thought it would eventually be found by future generations. But who? And why had they waited so long to reveal the truth? The walk back to the cabin gave Abram time to think about the implications of what he'd learned. If Sarah had been murdered, if the cover-up had involved his great-grandfather Samuel, then everything he thought he knew about his family's history was built on a lie. The Cole family's reputation in the valley, their standing in the community, even his own sense of identity, all of it was founded on a secret that someone had been desperate enough to kill for. Back at the cabin, Abram spread out his grandfather's old maps of the mountain, looking for clues about where the truth might be hidden. The tree that had fallen was marked on the maps, noted as a landmark for navigation. But there were other markings too, symbols and notations that he'd never paid much attention to before. One marking, near the site of an old mining claim, was annotated with the words S's Place in his grandfather's careful handwriting. The mining claim had been abandoned long before Abram was born, but the notation suggested it had been significant to someone named S, possibly Sarah. As evening approached, Abram made a decision that would change everything. He would follow the clues wherever they led, no matter how painful the truth might be. He owed that much to Sarah, whose real story had been hidden for more than a century. And he owed it to himself to know what kind of family he really came from. But first, he needed to understand who had left the evidence in the tree. The handwriting in the carved message was different from the inscription on Sarah's photograph. Someone else had known about Sarah's fate and had tried to preserve the evidence. Someone who had access to her personal belongings, but who couldn't, or dared not, reveal the truth openly. Rye seemed to sense the change in Abram's mood. The dog had been restless all day, pacing the cabin and whining softly whenever Abram examined the artifacts. Now, as darkness fell over the mountain, Rye took up position by the front door, ears pricked and alert, as if he expected someone to come calling, and perhaps someone would. If Abram's growing suspicions were correct, if Sarah Cole had been murdered and the crime covered up, then there might be others who knew the truth. Others who had been waiting for the tree to fall and the secret to be revealed. The mountain that had always been Abram's refuge suddenly felt less safe, less isolated. Every shadow could hide a threat. Every sound could signal danger. For the first time in 37 years of living alone on Coal Mountain, Abram found himself wishing he had neighbors close enough to call for help. But there was no going back now. The tree had fallen, the secret was out, and Abram Cole was about to learn that some family histories are written in blood. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. Abram was examining his grandfather's maps more carefully when he heard the distant rumble of an engine making its way up the mountain road. Vehicles were rare enough on Coal Mountain that Rye began barking before the sound was even clearly audible, and by the time the old pickup truck came into view, both man and dog were waiting on the front porch. The truck belonged to Doc Henley, whose family had been the Coles' nearest neighbors for 3 generations. Marcus Henley was in his 70s now, a retired physician who had delivered most of the babies in the valley and tended to their ailments until age forced him to pass his practice to a younger doctor in town. He'd known Abram since childhood and had been one of the few people to visit regularly after Abram's parents died. "Morning, Abram," Doc said as he climbed stiffly from the truck. "Heard you had some excitement up here yesterday." Tom Brennan was checking his fence line down near Willow Creek and said he heard a big tree come down. "Everything all right?" Abram felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. News traveled fast in a small valley, even when the nearest neighbors were miles apart. "Just an old pine finally gave up," he said carefully. "No damage to the cabin or anything important," Doc nodded, but his eyes were sharp behind his wire-rimmed glasses. He'd been a doctor too long not to notice when someone was holding something back. "Mind if I come in for coffee?" "These old bones don't handle the mountain roads like they used to." They sat at the kitchen table, and Abram was grateful he'd thought to put the artifacts away before Doc's arrival. The old physician was observant by nature and training, and questions about century-old bones and lockets would be hard to explain. But as they talked about the weather and the early spring, Abram found himself studying Doc's face for any sign that he knew more than he was letting on. "You know," Doc said after his second cup of coffee, "your grandfather used to tell me stories about the old days on this mountain. Some of them were quite interesting, especially the ones about things that happened before he was grown." "What kind of things?" Abram asked, trying to keep his voice casual. "Oh, family matters mostly. The challenges of living so far from town, the way folks had to handle problems on their own up here." Doc paused, his eyes meeting Abram's across the table. He mentioned once that there were some family stories that weren't meant for sharing. Said every family has secrets that are better left buried. The word "buried" hung in the air between them, and Abram wondered if it had been chosen deliberately. "Did he ever mention my great-aunt Sarah? The one who died young?" Doc's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. "Sarah Cole, yes, he mentioned her. Said losing her was the hardest thing his family ever went through. Changed his father, he said. Samuel Cole was never quite the same after she died. Did he ever talk about how she died? The circumstances, I mean. Fever, wasn't it? That was common enough in those days, especially among children. Before antibiotics, before proper medical care was available up here. Doc finished his coffee and stood to leave. Why the sudden interest in old family history? Abram walked him to the truck, choosing his words carefully. Just been thinking about the past lately. Living alone up here gives a man time to wonder about his roots. Doc climbed into his truck, but didn't immediately start the engine. Abram, if you ever find anything, documents, letters, anything that raises questions about the old days, you might want to think carefully before you go digging too deep. Sometimes the past is better left alone. After Doc drove away, Abram sat on his porch for a long time, thinking about the conversation. The old physician had clearly known more than he'd said, and his warning about leaving the past alone suggested that others in the valley might be aware of secrets surrounding Sarah Cole's death. But how many people knew, and why had they all remained silent for so long? That afternoon, Abram made his way to the old mining claim marked on his grandfather's map as S's Place. Walk took him through dense forest and up a steep ridge that most people would find challenging even in good weather. It was the kind of place a child might go to hide, or where someone might take a child who didn't want to be found. The mining claim was little more than a shallow excavation in the mountainside, probably dug in the 1870s when rumors of gold had brought prospectors to the area. A few rotting timber supports were all that remained of whatever structure had once protected the entrance. But as Abram explored the area more carefully, he found evidence that someone had spent time here long after the mining operation had been abandoned. Hidden behind a fallen log, partially buried under decades of accumulated leaves and debris, he found a metal box. The container was old, but well made, designed to keep its contents dry and protected. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, was a journal. The leather cover was cracked with age, but the pages inside were still readable. The handwriting was feminine, careful and young. The first entry was dated July 15, 1889, just 4 months before Sarah Cole's supposed death. Papa is angry again today. He says, I ask too many questions about things that aren't my concern. But I saw what he did to the Indian boy who came asking about water rights. I saw where he buried him, and I know it was wrong. Mama won't listen when I try to tell her. She says I have too much imagination. Abram's hands shook as he read the entry. An Indian boy, buried somewhere on Cole property. Another death, another secret. He turned the page and found more entries, each one revealing a pattern of violence and cover-up that painted his great-grandfather, Samuel Cole, in a very different light than family history had suggested. August 3rd, 1889. The sheriff came asking questions about the missing boy. Papa told him the boy never came here, but I know that's a lie. I can see the place where the earth was disturbed from my bedroom window. Sometimes at night I think I can hear voices coming from that direction. August 20th, 1889. I found Papa's gun hidden in the barn. There's blood on the barrel and he gets angry when I ask about it. He says if I don't stop asking questions, I might end up like others who couldn't mind their own business. September 15th, 1889. I'm scared now. Papa caught me writing in this journal and said if he finds it again, he'll make sure I never write anything again. I'm going to hide it in the old mine where he'll never think to look. If something happens to me, maybe someone will find this someday and know the truth. The final entry was dated October 30th, 1889, just a week before Sarah's official death date. Papa knows I saw him with the money. The bags of gold coins that man brought him for keeping quiet about the railroad land deals. I heard them talking about people who had to be removed because they knew too much. Papa saw me listening at the door. He smiled, but it wasn't a nice smile. He said accidents happen to little girls who see things they shouldn't. I'm going to run away tonight. If I can get to town, maybe the sheriff will believe me. But I'm afraid Papa will catch me first. Abram closed the journal and sat back against the cold stone of the mountainside. Sarah Cole hadn't died of fever. She'd been murdered by her own father to keep her from exposing his crimes. The elaborate cover-up, the false grave, the story about illness, all of it had been designed to hide the fact that Samuel Cole had killed his own daughter to protect his secret deals and cover up previous murders. But someone else had known the truth. Someone had taken Sarah's belongings and hidden them in the tree, along with evidence of what had really happened. The broken locket chain suggested there had been a struggle, that Sarah had fought before she died. The teeth marks could have been from an animal, or they could have been from something else entirely. As Abram made his way back to the cabin, the journal clutched tightly in his hands. He found himself looking at the familiar landscape with new eyes. How many other secrets were buried on Cole Mountain? How many other victims had been silenced to protect Samuel Cole's reputation and wealth? And most importantly, who else knew the truth? Doc Henley's warning suggested that the knowledge hadn't died with Samuel Cole. Someone in the valley was still keeping the secret, still protecting the family's reputation, even after all these years. That night, as Abram sat by his fire reading Sarah's journal entries over and over again, Rye began growling low in his throat. The dog was staring out the window toward the tree line, his hackles raised and his body tense with alert aggression. Someone was out there in the darkness, watching the cabin. Someone who might have seen Abram retrieve the journal from the old mine. Someone who knew that the secrets were finally coming to light and might be willing to kill again to keep them buried. Abram didn't sleep that night. He sat in his chair by the window with his grandfather's old hunting rifle across his knees, watching the tree line for any sign of movement. Rye remained on alert beside him, occasionally lifting his head to test the air for scents that might reveal the identity of their watcher. Around 3 a.m, the dog's ears perked up and he padded silently to the back door. Abram followed, moving carefully to avoid the creaky floorboard near the kitchen table. Through the small window in the door, he could see a figure moving through the trees behind the cabin. Whoever it was knew the terrain well enough to move quietly in the darkness, but not well enough to avoid Rye's keen senses. The figure paused at the edge of the clearing, and in the faint starlight, Abram caught a glimpse of an elderly man wearing a wide-brimmed hat. The stranger stood motionless for several minutes, as if studying the cabin and calculating his next move. Then, as quietly as he had appeared, he melted back into the forest. When morning came, Abram found tracks in the soft earth behind the cabin. The boot prints were distinctive, worn soles with a particular pattern of nails that suggested someone who spent a lot of time walking on rocky ground. More interesting was what he found near where the man had stood, a small piece of paper wrapped around a stone, clearly meant to be thrown at the cabin door, but apparently abandoned when the stranger realized he was being watched. The note was written in the same careful handwriting Abram recognized from his grandfather's maps. "Stop digging or join the others who ask too many questions." The message was signed with a simple initial. Abram stared at the note for a long time, his mind racing through the implications. H could be Henley, which would mean Doc's friendly visit the day before had been more of a reconnaissance mission than a social call. But it could also be someone else entirely, someone whose family had been involved in the cover-up from the beginning. Later that morning, Abram made a decision that he knew was risky but necessary. He loaded Sarah's journal and the other artifacts into his truck and drove down the mountain to the county courthouse in Pine Valley. If he was going to uncover the full truth about his family's past, he needed access to official records that might corroborate Sarah's account of her father's crimes. The courthouse was a stone building that had served the county since 1895, and its basement archives contained records going back to the area's first European settlement. The clerk, a middle-aged woman named Helen Morrison, was helpful but curious about Abram's sudden interest in century-old documents. Doing some family genealogy? She asked as she led him to the microfilm readers where old newspaper editions were stored. "Something like that," Abram replied, settling in to examine the Pine Valley Gazette from the fall of 1889. What he found in those yellowed pages was illuminating. The October 15th, 1889 edition carried a small notice about a missing Shoshone youth named Running Bear, who had disappeared while traveling through the valley to visit relatives in the south. The boy's family had offered a reward for information about his whereabouts, but subsequent editions of the paper made no mention of the case being resolved. More interesting was a series of articles from late 1889 about irregularities in railroad land purchases in the area. Several local ranchers had apparently received large payments for land that was later determined to have unclear title. The articles suggested that someone with inside knowledge of surveying errors had been profiting by selling the same parcels to multiple buyers. The final relevant article was Sarah Cole's obituary, published November 15, 1889. It was brief and unremarkable, except for one detail. It mentioned that she had been buried in a private family ceremony with no outside witnesses. Due to the contagious nature of her illness, Abram photographed the relevant pages with his phone, then moved on to the official death records for 1889, Sarah's death certificate. Listed the cause as brain fever, brought on by childhood illness, and it was signed by Dr. Edmund Henley, Doc's grandfather. The pieces were falling into place now. The Henley family had been involved in the cover-up from the beginning, providing the medical authority needed to make Sarah's false death certificate official. 3 generations of Henleys had kept the secret, and now Doc was warning Abram to stop investigating before he uncovered truths that powerful families in the valley had spent over a century protecting. But who was the mysterious H who had left the warning? If it wasn't Doc Henley himself, then someone else with connections to the original conspiracy was still alive and still willing to protect the secret. On his way back up the mountain, Abram stopped at the Pine Valley Library to research property records from the 1880s. What he discovered there made him understand the scope of what his great-grandfather had been involved in. Samuel Cole had owned significantly more land than family stories suggested, and much of it had been acquired through questionable transactions in the months before and after Sarah's death. The librarian, an elderly man named George Whitman, noticed Abram's interest in the old records and struck up a conversation. "You're one of the Mountain Coles, aren't you?" he asked. "I remember your grandfather from when I was a boy. He used to come to town every few months for supplies. Did you know him well?" "Well enough. He was a quiet man, kept to himself mostly, but he was generous when it came to the church and the school. Always made sure his donations were anonymous, though." George paused, studying Abram's face. "Funny thing about your family. There were always stories about money that came from somewhere other than timber and farming. Some folks said your great-grandfather had found gold up on that mountain, but others thought it came from less honest sources." "What kind of sources?" George lowered his voice, even though they were alone in the library. "There were rumors about deals with the railroad companies, about land that was sold multiple times to different buyers. And some folks said Samuel Cole knew things about certain disappearances that he never shared with the law." Abram felt a chill as he realized how widespread the suspicions about his family had been. "Disappearances? Indian boy went missing in 1889. A surveyor from back east vanished a year later. Couple of prospectors who were asking questions about land claims just up and disappeared without collecting their gear from the boarding house." George shook his head. "Of course, this was wild country back then. Lots of ways a man could meet his end without anyone being to blame. But Abram was beginning to understand that someone had been to blame, and that someone was his own great-grandfather. Samuel Cole hadn't just killed his daughter. He'd been responsible for multiple deaths, all designed to protect his illegal land dealings and hidden wealth. The drive back up the mountain gave Abram time to think about his next move. He had enough evidence now to piece together what had happened to Sarah, but he still didn't know who had preserved her belongings in the tree or who was currently trying to intimidate him into stopping his investigation. More importantly, he didn't know how far the current conspiracy extended. If the Henley family was still involved, if there were others in the valley who knew the truth and were willing to kill to protect it, then Abram might be in more danger than he realized. As he pulled into his driveway, he noticed immediately that something was wrong. The front door of his cabin was standing open, and Rye was nowhere to be seen. Abram grabbed his rifle from the gun rack in his truck and approached the cabin carefully, using the trees for cover. Inside, the cabin had been thoroughly searched. Drawers were pulled out, furniture was overturned, and every possible hiding place had been examined. Whoever had done this had been looking for something specific, and they'd been willing to break into an occupied home in broad daylight to find it, but it was the message carved into his kitchen table that made Abram's blood run cold. Last warning! The dog is safe for now. They had taken Rye, and the implication was clear. Stop investigating, or the dog would suffer the same fate as Sarah Cole and the others who had asked too many questions. Abram sank into his overturned chair and tried to think clearly despite the rage and fear coursing through him. Whoever was behind this had escalated beyond mere intimidation. They'd violated his home and taken the one companion who had made his isolated life bearable. But they'd also made a mistake. By taking Rye, they'd shown that they were still in the area, still watching, still actively working to protect secrets that should have died with Samuel Cole, and that meant Abram could find them. He spent the rest of the daylight hours putting his cabin back in order and preparing for what he now understood would be a confrontation. The people responsible for Sarah's death and the subsequent cover-up were still alive, still dangerous, and still willing to kill to protect their secret. But this time, they'd chosen the wrong victim. Abram Cole might be a solitary mountain man, but he was also the descendant of survivors, and he'd inherited more than just his great-grandfather's land. He'd inherited the determination that had kept the Cole family alive and thriving in one of the harshest environments in the country, and now he was going to use that determination to get his dog back and finally expose the truth about what had happened to Sarah Cole. That night, Abram prepared for war. He cleaned and loaded every weapon in the cabin, his grandfather's old Winchester, a more modern hunting rifle, and the .45 pistol he'd inherited from his father. He packed a backpack with supplies for several days in the wilderness, knowing that whoever had taken Rye wouldn't be found easily. But first, he needed to understand his enemy better. Using the boot prints he'd found behind his cabin, Abram began tracking the intruder's path through the forest. The trail led downhill toward the old logging road, but it also revealed something else. The person who had been watching his cabin walked with a slight limp, favoring his left leg. The tracks eventually reached a point where a vehicle had been parked, but not before Abram found something that made him reconsider everything he thought he knew about the situation. Caught on a thorny bush about head-high was a small piece of fabric, dark blue wool, the kind used in expensive winter coats. But more telling was what was pinned to the fabric, a small silver badge, tarnished with age but still readable. It was a railroad company badge, dated 1889, with the initials J.H. engraved beneath the company logo. Abram stared at the badge for a long time, trying to understand its significance. J.H. could be someone from the Henley family, but the railroad connection suggested something deeper. According to Sarah's journal, her father had been involved in corrupt land deals with railroad companies. Had someone from that era survived to continue protecting the secret? Or was this badge a family heirloom, passed down to someone who inherited both the knowledge and the responsibility for keeping it buried? The next morning brought unexpected help. Abram heard a vehicle approaching and was surprised to see not Doc Henley's familiar pickup, but a newer truck belonging to Sheriff Tom Brennan. The sheriff was a man in his 50s, competent and respected. But he'd grown up in the valley and might have divided loyalties when it came to old family secrets. "Morning, Abram," Brennan said as he climbed out of his truck. "Got a report that your place might have been broken into. Everything all right up here?" Abram studied the sheriff's face, trying to decide how much to reveal Someone did go through the cabin yesterday while I was in town. Took my dog. Took your dog? Brennan's eyebrows rose. That's a new one. Any idea who might want to steal a mountain dog? Could be connected to some family history I've been researching lately. Seems like someone doesn't want me digging into old records. The sheriff's expression grew more serious. What kind of old records? Abram made a decision to trust him, at least partially. He showed Brennan the railroad badge and explained about finding the artifacts in the fallen tree. He didn't mention Sarah's journal. That evidence was too dangerous to share until he knew more about who could be trusted. Brennan examined the badge carefully, then handed it back. This is interesting. The railroad company that owned this badge was involved in some questionable land deals back in the 1880s. There was a federal investigation, but nothing ever came of it. Too many important people would have been implicated. Important people like my great-grandfather. Samuel Cole was mentioned in some of the reports, yes. But so were a lot of other prominent families in the valley. Brennan paused, seeming to weigh his words carefully. Abram, I have to ask, have you found anything else? Documents, letters, anything that might shed light on what really happened back then? The question was loaded with implications. Either the sheriff was genuinely trying to help, or he was fishing for information on behalf of the people who had taken Rye. Abram decided to test him. If I had found something like that, hypothetically, what would you advise me to do with it? Hypothetically, I'd say bring it to me immediately. There are still people in this valley whose families were involved in those old scandals, and some of them have a lot to lose if certain truths came to light. Brennan met Abram's eyes directly. And I'd say that anyone investigating those old secrets should be very careful about who they trust. It was a warning, but it could be interpreted two ways. Either Brennan was alerting Abram to danger, or he was subtly threatening him. The ambiguity was probably intentional. After the sheriff left, Abram decided to take a more direct approach. Using his grandfather's detailed maps of the mountain, he identified every structure and landmark within a 10-mile radius of his cabin. If someone was holding Rye nearby, they'd need a secure location with shelter and water access. One possibility stood out: the old Henley hunting cabin, built in the 1920s on a remote section of their property about 8 miles north of Abram's place. It was accessible by an overgrown logging road and had been abandoned for years, but it would provide perfect isolation for someone who wanted to keep a captive animal without being discovered. The hike to the Henley cabin took Abram through some of the most rugged terrain on the mountain. He moved carefully, using game trails and natural cover to avoid being seen. If he was wrong about the location, he didn't want to reveal his suspicions to anyone who might be watching. The cabin came into view just before sunset, a weathered structure that had clearly been neglected for years. But there were recent signs of activity: tire tracks in the mud, footprints around the building, and most importantly, the sound of a dog barking from somewhere inside. Abram circled the cabin carefully, noting that there was only one vehicle parked nearby, an old Jeep with mud-covered license plates. Through a grimy window, he could see into the main room, where an elderly man sat at a rough wooden table. The man was facing away from the window, but his posture and the shape of his shoulders were familiar. It was Doc Henley, but not the kindly physician who had visited Abram's cabin. This was a man under stress, hunched over what appeared to be old documents spread across the table. And on the table beside the papers was a modern pistol. From another room came the sound of Rye whimpering, confirming that Abram had found the right place. But he'd also found more than he'd bargained for. Doc Henley wasn't just protecting old family secrets. He was actively involved in continuing the cover-up that had started with Samuel Cole more than a century ago. As Abram watched through the window, trying to plan his next move, Doc suddenly stood and walked to a wooden chest in the corner of the room. When he opened it, Abram could see that it was filled with old documents, photographs, and what looked like personal belongings. At the top of the pile was a child's dress, faded but carefully preserved, Sarah's dress, the one she'd been wearing when she died, Doc handled the dress with reverence, almost tenderness, and for a moment his shoulders shook as if he were crying. Then he carefully folded it and placed it back in the chest. Along with what Abram now realized was a complete collection of evidence related to Sarah Cole's murder, the Henley family hadn't just helped cover up the crime. They'd been collecting and preserving evidence of it for over a century. But why? Were they planning to eventually expose the truth, or were they keeping the evidence as insurance against other families involved in the conspiracy? As night fell completely, Abram heard voices approaching the cabin. Doc wasn't alone. He was meeting with someone else, someone who arrived on foot through the forest. From his hiding place behind a fallen log, Abram watched as a second figure entered the cabin. The newcomer was a woman, elderly but moving with the kind of purposeful energy that suggested she was accustomed to being in charge. When she stepped into the lamplight, Abram recognized her immediately. It was Helen Morrison, the courthouse clerk who had helped him research the old records. The woman who had seemed so helpful and innocent was apparently another member of the conspiracy to keep Sarah Cole's murder secret. But as Abram listened to their conversation through the thin cabin walls, he began to understand that the situation was far more complex than he'd realized. These people weren't just protecting a century-old secret. They were protecting something that was still actively dangerous to families throughout the valley. And that meant Sarah Cole's murder was just the beginning of a story that was still being written. Abram pressed closer to the cabin wall, straining to hear the conversation inside. What he learned in the next 20 minutes changed everything he thought he understood about the conspiracy surrounding his family's past. The tree falling wasn't supposed to happen for another 50 years. Helen Morrison was saying, her voice tight with anxiety. Our calculations were based on the growth rate surveys from the 1960s. Someone miscalculated. It doesn't matter how it happened, Doc replied wearily. What matters is that Abram found everything we've been protecting. The locket, the boots, probably the journal too by now. How much does he know? Enough to be dangerous. He's been to the courthouse, to the library. He's asking the right questions. Doc's voice carried a note of resignation. We can't contain this much longer, Helen. Maybe it's time to consider telling him the truth. The truth? Helen's voice rose sharply. Do you have any idea what that would mean? Not just for our families, but for half the valley? The railroad money built this entire community. The schools, the hospital, the churches, all of it was funded with blood money from Samuel Cole's deals. Abram felt his world shift as he listened. The conspiracy wasn't just about covering up murder. It was about protecting the economic foundation of Pine Valley itself. Samuel Cole's corrupt land deals had generated enormous wealth, and that wealth had been used to build the infrastructure that generations of families had depended on. There's more, Doc continued. I found evidence that Abram isn't the only one digging into the past. Someone in Denver has been asking questions about the old railroad contracts. A historian working on a book about Western land fraud. If this story breaks nationally, then we do what we've always done, Helen interrupted. We protect the community. Our families have kept this secret for 5 generations. We're not going to let one lonely mountain man destroy everything our ancestors built. Doc was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was heavy with conflict. I've been a doctor for 47 years, Helen. I've spent my life trying to heal people, to do no harm. What we're talking about is survival. Not just ours, but the survival of everyone in this valley who depends on the prosperity that came from those original investments. Helen's voice turned cold. Your grandfather understood that when he signed that death certificate. Your father understood it when he helped move the bones from the mine shaft to that tree. And you'll understand it too, or you'll find yourself in the same position as Sarah Cole. The threat was unmistakable, and it revealed something that made Abram's blood run cold. They hadn't just hidden Sarah's body in the tree, they'd moved it there from somewhere else. The mine shaft Sarah had mentioned in her journal had been her original burial place, but someone had later relocated her remains to the hollow tree. But why move her? And when? The answer came from Helen's next words. The drought of 1934 exposed too much. When the creek level dropped, you could see the disturbed earth near the mine. Your father made the right choice, moving her to the tree where she'd be safe until the wood rotted enough to reveal her naturally. Abram realized with horror that his own grandfather had been part of the cover-up. The man who had raised him, who had taught him to love and respect the mountain, had helped move a child's murdered body to ensure the secret would remain hidden. The notation on the map, S's place, hadn't marked where Sarah had played, but where she'd been buried after being moved from her original grave. "The dog is making too much noise," Doc said suddenly. "Someone might hear him." "Then shut him up," Helen replied coldly. "Permanently, if necessary." That decided it for Abram. He couldn't wait any longer to act. Moving silently around to the back of the cabin, he found the window that led to the room where Rye was being held. The glass was old and loose in its frame, and with careful pressure, he was able to work it open without making noise. Rye was tied to a support beam in what had once been a bedroom, but his tail started wagging the moment he saw Abram's face at the window. The dog had enough sense to remain quiet as Abram cut through the rope with his hunting knife and lifted him through the window, but their escape didn't go unnoticed. As they reached the tree line, a shot rang out behind them, and Abram heard Helen shouting, "He was here!" He heard everything. Running through the forest at night with a dog was dangerous under the best circumstances, but Abram knew these woods better than anyone except his grandfather had. He led Rye along game trails that would be invisible to pursuers, using the creek beds and rocky outcroppings to mask their scent and footprints. Behind them, he could hear voices and see flashlight beams sweeping through the trees. Doc and Helen had called for help, probably other members of the conspiracy who lived in the valley. Abram realized he might be facing more enemies than he'd imagined. They reached his cabin just before dawn, but Abram knew it wasn't safe to stay there. If half the valley was involved in protecting the secret, then his isolated mountain home had become a trap. He needed to get to town, to find someone in authority who wasn't part of the conspiracy, but first he had to secure the evidence. Sarah's journal was hidden in his truck, but there were other things he needed to protect. Working quickly, he gathered the artifacts from the tree, copies of the documents he'd found at the courthouse, and his grandfather's maps with their cryptic notations. Everything went into a waterproof bag that he buried in a spot only he and Rye would be able to find again. As he prepared to leave the mountain that had been his home for most of his adult life, Abram found a final piece of evidence that completed the picture of his family's dark legacy. Hidden behind a loose board in his grandfather's bedroom was a metal box similar to the one that had contained Sarah's journal. Inside was a confession, written in his grandfather's careful handwriting and dated just 3 months before the old man's death. "I was 12 years old when my father told me what really happened to Sarah. I was old enough to understand that our family's prosperity came from her silence, and that my silence was the price of keeping it. I helped move her body to the tree in 1934, and I've regretted it every day since. But I was a coward, and I let fear of losing everything keep me from telling the truth." The confession went on to detail not just Sarah's murder, but the other killings that had followed. The Indian boy, the surveyor, the prospectors, even a federal investigator who had gotten too close to the truth in 1923. All of them buried in unmarked graves scattered across Coal Mountain, all of them killed to protect the secret that had made the Cole family wealthy and powerful. But the final paragraph of the confession contained a revelation that made Abram understand why the conspiracy had survived for so long. The railroad money didn't just corrupt my father, it corrupted everyone who benefited from it. Half the families in Pine Valley have ancestors who took bribes, who falsified documents, who helped cover up crimes. The Henleys, the Morrisons, the Brennans, the Whitmans, all of us became accomplices to murder because we were too greedy to refuse the money and too cowardly to expose the truth. We built our community on blood, and we've been paying for it ever since. Sheriff Brennan's family was part of the conspiracy. So was George Whitman from the library. The corruption ran so deep that Abram couldn't trust anyone in Pine Valley to help him expose the truth. But he could trust one person, himself. And he could trust Rye, who had already proven his loyalty by surviving captivity without revealing Abram's location. As the sun rose over Cole Mountain, Abram Cole made a decision that would have made his great-grandfather proud, even if it destroyed everything the old man had built. He was going to expose the truth about Sarah's murder and all the other crimes that had followed. No matter what it cost him or anyone else, the conspiracy had lasted for 134 years, but it was about to end. Because sometimes, when the past refuses to stay buried, the only choice is to dig it up completely and let the sunlight disinfect the rot that has been. Festering in the darkness, Abram was loading the last of his supplies into the truck when he heard an engine approaching from the valley road. But instead of the hostile pursuit he expected, the vehicle that emerged from the morning mist was a dusty sedan with government plates. Two people got out, a middle-aged woman in a business suit and a younger man carrying what appeared to be surveying equipment. "Mr. Cole," the woman called out. "I'm Agent Sarah Martinez with the Department of Justice, and this is Dr. James Wheeler from the Smithsonian Institution. We'd like to speak with you about some discoveries you may have made recently." Abram kept his hand near his rifle but didn't raise it. "How did you know about any discoveries?" Agent Martinez smiled, but it was a tired expression that spoke of long investigation and difficult truths. "We've been investigating irregularities in 19th century railroad land grants for the past 3 years. Your great-grandfather's name has come up repeatedly in connection with fraudulent transactions that may have involved federal crimes. Federal crimes that were never prosecuted," Dr. Wheeler added, setting down his equipment, "because too many powerful people were involved, and because key witnesses had a habit of disappearing." Abram studied their faces, trying to determine if this was another trap or if help had finally arrived. "What kind of witnesses?" "Native American tribal members who had legitimate land claims, government surveyors who discovered the fraud, railroad employees who tried to report the corruption." Agent Martinez pulled out a thick folder from her car. "And one 7-year-old girl named Sarah Cole, who apparently saw too much for her own good." The revelation that federal agents already knew about Sarah's murder hit Abram like a physical blow. "How long have you known?" "We've suspected for 2 years, but we've been missing the crucial evidence. Until 3 days ago, when seismic sensors placed throughout this region detected an unusual tree fall on your property." Dr. Wheeler smiled at Abram's surprised expression. "The Smithsonian has been monitoring this area as part of a study on the preservation of archaeological evidence in natural environments. When a 200-year-old tree with a known hollow core suddenly fell on a calm day, we knew something significant had been revealed." Agent Martinez opened her folder and showed Abram a collection of photographs and documents. "We also know that certain families in Pine Valley have been working to suppress evidence of the original crimes. Phone conversations that mentioned your name, unusual activity at the courthouse archives, vehicles moving on mountain roads at night, all of it has been under surveillance." Abram felt a mixture of relief and anger. "You've been watching me this whole time? While they took my dog, while they threatened me? We had to let events unfold naturally to identify all the players in the conspiracy," Agent Martinez said apologetically. "If we'd intervened too early, we would have missed the opportunity to expose the full extent of the cover-up. Sometimes the only way to catch a century-old conspiracy is to let it reveal itself." Dr. Wheeler was examining the area around the fallen tree with professional interest. "The preservation conditions here are remarkable. The tree's hollow would have created a perfect environment for organic materials, stable temperature, controlled humidity, protection from scavengers. Whatever was hidden inside would be in excellent condition." "It was," Abram said, making a decision to trust them. I found Sarah's belongings, her journal, evidence of multiple murders. But there's more. He told them about his grandfather's confession, about the scope of the conspiracy, about the families who had built their prosperity on blood money. Agent Martinez took notes as he spoke, occasionally asking clarifying questions. When he finished, she closed her notebook and looked at him seriously. "Mr. Cole, what I'm about to tell you is going to be difficult to hear, but you need to understand the full scope of what we're dealing with." She pulled out another set of documents from her folder. The conspiracy to cover up these crimes didn't end in 1889. It's been active and ongoing for 134 years. We have evidence of at least 12 additional murders between 1890 and 1987, all of them people who discovered pieces of the truth and tried to expose it. The number staggered Abram. 12 more victims, killed over nearly a century to protect the secret of Samuel Cole's original crimes. Who were they? Historians, journalists, genealogists, even a few family members who developed guilty consciences. Agent Martinez showed him photographs of people from different eras. A newspaper reporter from the 1920s, a college professor from the 1960s, a documentary filmmaker from the 1980s. The most recent was Dr. Patricia Henley in 1987. Henley, related to Doc, his daughter. She was a forensic anthropologist who discovered evidence of the original burial sites while doing research for her doctoral dissertation. She tried to convince her father to come forward with the truth. Agent Martinez's expression was grim. Her death was ruled an accident, a fall while hiking alone on the mountain. But we have evidence that suggests otherwise. The revelation that Doc Henley had been involved in his own daughter's death added a new dimension of horror to the conspiracy. These weren't just people protecting old family secrets. They were killers who had been murdering anyone who threatened their carefully constructed lies for over a century. "There's something else," Dr. Wheeler said, looking up from his examination of the tree. "The way this tree fell, it wasn't natural. The break pattern suggests the use of a chemical accelerant, something that would weaken the wood fiber over time, until a slight pressure would cause catastrophic failure." Abrams stared at him in shock. "You're saying someone made the tree fall? Someone who knew about the evidence inside and wanted it to be discovered? The process would have taken months to work, probably started sometime last fall." Dr. Wheeler pointed to discoloration in the wood around the break. "This was deliberate, Mr. Cole. Someone wanted you to find Sarah's remains and start asking questions." Agent Martinez was nodding as the pieces fell into place. "We suspected there might be a whistleblower inside the conspiracy. Someone with access to the evidence, but who couldn't reveal it directly without endangering themselves or their family." The implications were staggering. Someone within the conspiracy had decided that 134 years of murder and cover-up was enough. They had sabotaged the tree to ensure that Sarah's evidence would finally be found, knowing that it would trigger a chain of events that would expose the truth. But who? And why now? The answer came from an unexpected source. As they stood discussing the implications of the deliberate tree fall, another vehicle approached from the mountain road. This time it was Doc Henley's truck, but he wasn't alone. Sheriff Brennan was with him, and both men appeared to be unarmed and showing signs of distress. Doc climbed out of the truck slowly, like a man who had aged decades in the past few days. When he spoke, his voice was heavy with exhaustion and regret. "Agent Martinez, I assume. We've been expecting you." He looked at Abram with something that might have been relief. "I'm the one who weakened the tree. I'm the one who made sure Sarah would finally be found." The confession sent shockwaves through everything Abram thought he understood about the situation. Doc Henley, whom he'd seen as one of the primary conspirators, had actually been working to expose the truth. "My daughter Patricia was right," Doc continued, his voice breaking. "This secret has poisoned our community for long enough. When she tried to reveal the truth in 1987, I was too afraid to support her. I chose the conspiracy over my own child, and I've regretted it every day since." Sheriff Brennan stepped forward, his own expression filled with shame. "The federal investigation 3 years ago spooked a lot of people. Some of the families wanted to eliminate anyone who might talk, including Doc. When they realized he was having second thoughts about the cover-up, they made plans to silence him permanently, so I decided to act first, Doc said. I spent months treating that tree with chemicals that would weaken it gradually. I knew that when it fell, Abram would find Sarah's remains and start asking the right questions. I also knew that the federal investigation would eventually lead to the truth. Agent Martinez studied Doc's face carefully. You've been protecting evidence for decades while planning to eventually expose it. That's why you preserved Sarah's dress, why you kept detailed records of all the crimes. Someone had to maintain the proof. Too many people had died for the truth to be lost completely. Doc pulled a key from his pocket and handed it to Agent Martinez. The storage unit in Pine Valley contains everything. Documents, photographs, personal belongings from all the victims. I've been keeping it safe for the day when justice could finally be served. The plot twist was complete, but it raised new questions about the current danger. If Doc had been working to expose the conspiracy, who had taken Rye and threatened Abram? Who were the people still willing to kill to keep the secret buried? The answer came in the form of approaching vehicles. Multiple trucks and SUVs coming up the mountain road at high speed. The faction within the conspiracy that wanted to eliminate all witnesses was making their final move, and they were coming in force. Get down! Agent Martinez shouted, drawing her weapon as the first shots rang out across the mountain clearing. The battle for the truth about Sarah Cole was about to be fought with more than just words and evidence. The gunfire shattered the morning calm as bullets splintered the wood of Abram's cabin and sent everyone diving for cover behind vehicles and trees. Agent Martinez was speaking rapidly into her radio, calling for backup that was still 30 minutes away. The approaching vehicles had spread out to surround the clearing, trapping them in what had become a killing ground. How many of them are there? Abram shouted over the sound of automatic weapons fire. Sheriff Brennan, crouched behind his patrol car with his service weapon drawn, counted muzzle flashes through the trees. At least 8, maybe 10. They've got us surrounded and outgunned. Doc Henley was pressed against the wheel of his truck, clutching a small pistol with shaking hands. I never thought they'd go this far. Helen Morrison, George Whitman, some of the younger generation who inherited the secret, they're all out there. Dr. Wheeler was using his surveying equipment to mark positions and distances, turning his scientific training into tactical advantage. The main group is positioned along the tree line to the east, 2 vehicles blocking the road down the mountain. At least 1 sniper in the old fire tower to the north. Abram knew this mountain better than anyone still alive, and that knowledge was about to become their only advantage. There's a way out through the creek bed on the west side. It's too rocky for vehicles, but we can make it on foot to the old logging road. What about the evidence? Agent Martinez asked, reloading her pistol as another burst of gunfire peppered their position. Already secured, Abram replied, thinking of the waterproof bag he'd buried earlier. But first, we need to get to that storage unit in town. If they kill us here, they'll destroy whatever Doc has been protecting. The shooting stopped suddenly, replaced by an eerie silence that was somehow more threatening than the gunfire had been. A voice called out from the trees, Helen Morrison, sounding nothing like the helpful courthouse clerk who had assisted Abram's research. Dr. Henley, we know you're behind this federal investigation. Come out and we can still reach an arrangement that protects everyone's interests. Doc's laugh was bitter. Arrangement? Like the arrangement you made with my daughter Patricia. Your daughter was going to destroy everything our families built together, just like you're trying to do now. Helen's voice carried across the clearing with cold authority. But it's not too late to reconsider. The federal agents can have an accident on these dangerous mountain roads. The evidence can disappear again, and you can go back to your quiet retirement. Agent Martinez whispered into her radio again, then turned to the group. Backup is 20 minutes out, but we have assets moving into position. If we can hold them for another quarter hour. Her words were cut off by the roar of an engine and the crash of splintering wood as one of the attackers drove a large pickup truck directly into Abram's cabin. The building collapsed in a shower of debris and broken glass, destroying decades of family memories and eliminating their cover. "The creek bed," Abram said grimly. "We move now or we don't move at all." But as they prepared to make their desperate escape, a new complication emerged. From the wreckage of the cabin came a sound that made Abram's blood run cold, Rise howling. The dog hadn't been in the vehicle with Helen and her allies. He'd been hidden in the cabin, probably as bait to keep Abram from leaving the mountain. "I have to get him," Abram said, starting toward the burning debris. "It's a trap," Sheriff Brennan warned. "They want you out in the open." "Then that's where I'll be," Abram replied, checking his rifle and preparing to move. But Doc Henley placed a restraining hand on his arm. "Wait, there's something else you need to know about the evidence. The storage unit isn't just a hiding place. It's rigged with a dead man's switch. If I don't check in every 72 hours, everything inside gets transmitted to news outlets, federal agencies, and historical archives across the country." Agent Martinez stared at him. "You've been sitting on a doomsday device this whole time." "I learned from my daughter's mistake. Patricia tried to expose the truth through official channels, and they killed her for it. I made sure that if anything happened to me, the truth would come out anyway." Doc's smile was grim. "The switch was set to trigger tomorrow morning. Helen and her people have less than 18 hours to silence everyone who knows about it. The revelation changed everything about their tactical situation. The attackers weren't just trying to eliminate witnesses, they were racing against a deadline that could expose the conspiracy regardless of who survived the mountain battle. That's why they're so desperate," Sheriff Brennan realized. "They can't just kill us and disappear. They have to get to that storage unit and disarm the dead man's switch." Agent Martinez was already formulating a plan. "Then we don't try to escape. We make them come to us, and we hold them here until backup arrives and the switch triggers." But Abram was still focused on the sounds coming from the wreckage of his cabin. Rise howling had changed to something more urgent, more desperate. The dog wasn't just trapped. He was trying to warn them about something. "There," Dr. Wheeler pointed toward the ruins. "Movement in the debris. But it's not the dog." Through the smoke and settling dust, they could see a figure moving carefully through the wreckage. Someone searching for something specific among the destroyed remnants of Abram's life. The person was dressed in dark clothing and moved with the efficiency of someone who knew exactly what they were looking for. "They're after the family documents," Doc realized. "Your grandfather's confession, the maps. Anything that might corroborate the evidence in the storage unit." The searcher suddenly straightened and held up something that caught the light, a metal box that had survived the destruction. Abram recognized it immediately as the container that had held his grandfather's confession and the other family papers he hadn't had time to secure. "We can't let them have that," Agent Martinez said, raising her weapon, but before she could fire, the situation took another unexpected turn. The searcher in the ruins wasn't one of Helen Morrison's allies. It was a young woman Abram didn't recognize, someone who was clearly working against the attackers' interests. The woman spotted their group and made her way carefully toward them, using the wreckage for cover. When she was close enough to speak without shouting, she called out in a voice that carried decades of suppressed pain. "Mr. Cole, my name is Rebecca Henley. I'm Doc's granddaughter, and I'm Patricia Henley's daughter. I've been waiting 36 years for someone to finally expose the truth about what happened to my mother." The final piece of the puzzle fell into place. Patricia Henley's daughter had grown up knowing that her mother had been murdered, and she'd been planning her own investigation into the conspiracy. The young woman who'd been searching through the cabin ruins wasn't looking for evidence to destroy. She was trying to save it. "I've been monitoring their communications," Rebecca continued, holding up a sophisticated radio scanner. "They're planning to burn down the entire mountain to destroy any evidence they might have missed. They've got accelerants positioned throughout the forest, and they're going to make it look like a natural wildfire." The scope of their desperation was becoming clear. The conspirators weren't just willing to commit murder. They were prepared to destroy thousands of acres of wilderness and potentially kill innocent campers and hikers to cover their tracks. "How long do we have?" Agent Martinez asked. Rebecca checked her watch. The fire teams are already in position. They're waiting for full daylight, so the burns will spread faster and look more natural. Maybe 2 hours. Abram looked around at the people who had become his unlikely allies in the fight for truth. A federal agent, a Smithsonian researcher, a sheriff who'd inherited his family's guilt, an old doctor seeking redemption, and a young woman carrying on her murdered mother's work. Against them were arrayed the descendants of murderers and thieves, people who had built their lives on blood money and were willing to kill again to protect it. But they had one advantage that the conspirators didn't expect. They knew about the dead man's switch, and they knew about the planned fire. That knowledge, combined with Abram's intimate familiarity with the mountain terrain, might be enough to turn the tables on their attackers. Here's what we're going to do, Abram said, formulating a plan that would either save them all or get them killed in the next few hours. We're not running and we're not hiding. We're going to end this conspiracy the same way it started, with fire and blood. But this time, the truth is going to survive. From somewhere in the burning cabin debris, Rye's howling took on a different note, not distress, but the ancient call of a predator that had caught the scent of its prey. The final battle for Sarah Cole's legacy was about to begin. Abram's plan was simple but dangerous. Using his knowledge of the mountain's hidden trails and natural features, they would split into 2 groups. Agent Martinez and Sheriff Brennan would create a diversion by making noise and movement near the main cabin site, drawing the attackers' attention, while Abram, Doc, Rebecca, and Dr. Wheeler made their way to the old mine shaft where Sarah had originally been buried. Why the mine? Rebecca asked as they prepared to move. Because that's where this all started, Abram replied, checking his rifle one final time. And because there's something there that might help us turn the tables. What Abram hadn't told the others was that his grandfather's confession had mentioned more than just Sarah's murder. The old mine shaft had been used as a burial ground for multiple victims over the decades, and Samuel Cole had hidden something there that he'd considered insurance against his partners in the railroad conspiracy, evidence that could destroy them all if they ever turned against him. The movement through the forest was treacherous. Helen Morrison's people had positioned themselves strategically throughout the area, and more than once the group had to freeze in place as armed figures passed within yards of their hiding spots. Rye, who had somehow freed himself from the cabin wreckage, rejoined them during the journey and proved invaluable as an early warning system, his acute senses detecting danger before human eyes could spot it. Dr. Wheeler, despite his academic background, proved surprisingly adept at moving quietly through rough terrain. Field archaeology teaches you to be observant and careful, he whispered when Rebecca commented on his stealth skills. Doc Henley was struggling more with the physical demands of the trek, but his knowledge of the mountain's history was crucial. The mine shaft entrance is hidden behind that rockfall, he said, pointing to what looked like a natural avalanche scar on the mountainside. Your great-grandfather triggered that collapse, deliberately in 1923, to hide the bodies after the federal investigator got too close. They reached the concealed entrance just as gunfire erupted. From the direction of the cabin, Agent Martinez and Sheriff Brennan were executing their part of the plan, using the burning wreckage and abandoned vehicles to create the impression of a desperate last stand. The mine entrance was exactly where Doc had indicated, concealed behind tons of loose rock that had been arranged to look natural but could be moved by someone who knew the right sequence. Abram had learned the technique from his grandfather as a child, thinking it was just an interesting piece of mountain lore. Inside the mine, the air was cold and still, carrying the musty scent of old wood and older secrets. Dr. Wheeler activated a powerful LED flashlight that revealed the extent of the excavation, a tunnel that extended deep into the mountainside, with side chambers that had been carved out over decades of covert activity. My God, Rebecca breathed, staring at the carefully arranged remains that lined the walls of the first chamber. How many people did they kill? Abram counted at least 15 sets of human remains, some clearly ancient, others more recent. Each skeleton was accompanied by personal belongings, and what appeared to be documentation of their identity and the reason for their murder. Samuel Cole hadn't just been a killer, he'd been a meticulous record keeper, preserving evidence of every crime as potential leverage against his co-conspirators. But it was the far end of the chamber that held what Abram had been looking for. A metal strongbox, larger than the others they'd found, sat on a natural stone shelf. The lock was old but sturdy, and it took Dr. Wheeler's archaeological tools and Abram's brute strength to break it open. Inside were documents that made everything else they'd discovered pale in comparison. Contracts with railroad executives, detailed maps of fraudulent land deals, correspondence with government officials who had been bribed to look the other way. But most importantly, there were photographs, images that proved beyond doubt the identities of everyone involved in the conspiracy, including several people who were still alive and still active in covering up the crimes. "This is incredible," Rebecca said, photographing the documents with her phone. "This evidence doesn't just prove the historical crimes, it shows the modern cover-up too." Names, dates, bank account numbers, everything. Doc was examining one particular document with a mixture of fascination and horror. "This is a contract for the murder of the federal investigator in 1923. It's signed by representatives of 5 different families, including mine. They actually put a price on someone's head and documented it." The sound of approaching voices outside the mine interrupted their examination of the evidence. Helen Morrison's people had tracked them down, and the entrance to the mine was about to be compromised. "There's another way out," Abram said, pointing toward a narrow passage at the back of the chamber. "It connects to the old creek bed, about half a mile down the mountain. But we'll have to leave most of this evidence behind." "Not all of it," Rebecca said, stuffing the most damaging documents into her backpack. "And not before we ensure it can't be destroyed." She pulled out a small device that Abram recognized as a satellite communication unit. "Military grade," she explained, seeing his surprised expression. "I've been planning this confrontation for years. Everything we've found here is being transmitted in real time to secure servers in 3 different countries." The revelation that Rebecca had come prepared with sophisticated equipment suggested that her investigation had been far more extensive than anyone had realized. She wasn't just Patricia Henley's daughter seeking justice. She was a professional with resources and connections that could ensure the truth would finally be exposed. As they prepared to escape through the rear passage, Dr. Wheeler made one final discovery that changed everything. Behind the strongbox, hidden in a natural crevice in the rock wall, was a small metal cylinder that contained a rolled document. When he carefully unrolled it, the paper revealed itself to be a map marked with locations throughout the western United States. "This isn't just about Pine Valley," he said, studying the markings. "This conspiracy extends across multiple states. Railroad land fraud, mineral rights theft, government corruption. Samuel Cole was part of something much larger than we realized." The map showed dozens of locations where similar crimes had been committed, each marked with symbols that indicated the type of fraud and the families involved. What had started as an investigation into one little girl's murder had uncovered evidence of a conspiracy that had operated across the American West for over 50 years. "We have to get this information to Agent Martinez," Abram said. But his words were cut off by the sound of explosions outside the mine. The attackers weren't just trying to capture them. They were collapsing the mine entrance to bury the evidence and anyone inside it. The narrow rear passage suddenly became their only hope for survival. As they crawled through the cramped tunnel, following the ancient watercourse that had carved it, Abram could hear the rumble of falling rock behind them. Helen Morrison and her allies were willing to destroy a century of carefully preserved evidence rather than allow it to see the light of day, but they had underestimated the reach of modern technology and the determination of people who had spent their entire lives seeking justice for murdered family members. Even as the mine collapsed behind them, Rebecca's satellite uplink continued transmitting, sending the evidence to locations where it could never be suppressed or destroyed. The passage finally opened onto the creek bed, and they emerged into daylight to find Agent Martinez and Sheriff Brennan waiting for them. The federal backup had finally arrived, helicopters circling overhead and armed agents moving through the forest to surround the remaining conspirators. "Did you find what you were looking for?" Agent Martinez asked. Abram looked back at the collapsed mine entrance, then at the evidence-filled backpack Rebecca carried, then at the people who had risked their lives to expose a truth that had been buried for 134 years. "We found more than we were looking for," he said, "and Sarah Cole is finally going to get the justice she deserved." The final confrontation took place in the same clearing where Sarah Cole had played as a child, where the ancient pine had stood guard over her secrets for more than a century. Federal agents had surrounded Helen Morrison and her remaining allies, but the conspirators were making their last desperate stand among the trees where their ancestors had first chosen murder over justice. Helen emerged from the forest with her hands raised, but her expression showed no surrender, only the cold calculation of someone who had spent her entire life protecting terrible secrets. Behind her came George Whitman from the library, two men Abram recognized as members of prominent Valley families, and surprisingly, a woman in her 30s who looked familiar but whom he couldn't immediately place. "Agent Martinez," Helen called out as she approached the federal perimeter. "I think we can still reach an understanding that benefits everyone involved. The only understanding we're interested in is your unconditional surrender," Martinez replied, her weapon trained on the group. "You're under arrest for conspiracy, murder, destruction of federal evidence, and about 30 other charges we're still calculating." Helen's laugh was brittle but defiant. "You have no idea what you're dealing with. The evidence you think you found? It's just the tip of the iceberg. There are people in Washington, people with real power, who have been protecting this secret for generations. You arrest us, and you'll find your investigation shut down before you can file the paperwork." But Rebecca stepped forward, holding up her satellite communication device. "Those people in Washington. We have evidence about them too. Names, bank accounts, documented payments for their silence. Everything Samuel Cole preserved as insurance against his partners is now in the hands of journalists and federal prosecutors across the country." The younger woman with Helen suddenly broke away from the group and ran toward Rebecca. "You don't understand," she shouted. "If this comes out, it won't just destroy the guilty families. It'll destroy everyone in the valley. The schools, the hospitals, the infrastructure, all of it was built with this money. You're going to make innocent people pay for crimes their ancestors committed." Abram recognized her then. She was one of the teachers at the elementary school, a woman who had genuinely been trying to do good with resources she hadn't known were tainted by blood. Her presence with the conspirators revealed the moral complexity that had allowed the cover-up to persist for so long. Not everyone involved was evil. Some were simply trapped by circumstances and choices made generations before their birth. "Sarah Cole was 7 years old," Doc Henley said quietly, stepping forward to face the group. "She was innocent too, and she was murdered by her own father to protect money that was stolen from Native American tribes and defrauded from the federal government. How many more innocent people have to die to protect that sin?" George Whitman, looking older than his years, finally spoke up. "My family has run the library for 4 generations. We've used the money from those original investments to provide education and resources to this community. Are you going to destroy all of that to satisfy some abstract notion of justice for people who died over a century ago?" Dr. Wheeler, who had been documenting everything with scientific precision, stepped forward with a piece of evidence that silenced the moral arguments. From his equipment bag, he pulled out a small skull, clearly that of a child, clearly very old. "This is Sarah Cole's skull," he said, his voice carrying the weight of professional authority. "Do you see these fracture patterns? She wasn't just murdered. She was beaten to death with a blunt instrument. probably a shovel, based on the shape of the impact marks. She suffered before she died, and she died in terror. The sight of Sarah's skull, the physical evidence of her brutal murder, seemed to drain the fight out of everyone except Helen Morrison. The old woman's face showed no emotion as she looked at the remains of the child whose death had started the conspiracy that had defined her family's existence. Samuel Cole was protecting more than just railroad money, Helen said finally. He was protecting the future of this entire region. The land deals, the mineral rights, the water access, all of it was necessary to build a civilization in the wilderness. One little girl's life against the prosperity of thousands? The mathematics are simple. Agent Martinez stared at her in horror. You're talking about a child who was murdered by her own father. There is no mathematical equation that justifies that. Isn't there? Helen's voice turned cold. How many children have lived better lives because of the schools and hospitals that money built? How many families have prospered because of the infrastructure it funded? Sarah Cole died so that thousands of other children could live. The rationalization revealed the depth of the moral corruption that had allowed the conspiracy to survive for so long. The conspirators hadn't just been protecting a secret. They'd been protecting a worldview that treated murder as an acceptable cost of progress. But it was Abram who provided the final word on their twisted logic. Walking over to where Rye sat beside the fallen tree, he knelt and placed his hand on the dog's head, drawing strength from the animal's simple loyalty and trust. My great-grandfather didn't kill Sarah to build schools and hospitals, he said, rising to face Helen. He killed her because she was going to expose him as a thief and a murderer. Everything that came after, all the good works, all the community building, that was just his. Descendants trying to buy forgiveness for a crime that can't be forgiven. The sound of approaching helicopters filled the air as additional federal agents arrived to process the crime scene and arrest the conspirators. But Helen Morrison made one final attempt to escape justice, pulling a concealed pistol and pointing it not at the agents, but at Rebecca. You've destroyed everything, she snarled. 4 generations of careful building, all ruined by one idealistic girl who couldn't leave the past alone. The shot that rang out didn't come from Helen's gun. Sheriff Brennan, despite his family's complicity in the original conspiracy, chose justice over loyalty and fired the shot that ended Helen Morrison's threat permanently. As she fell, the last active conspirator in a 134-year-old murder plot, she carried with her the final secrets of families who had built their prosperity on blood and maintained it through generations of silence. Agent Martinez knelt beside Helen's body and carefully removed the pistol from her hand. When she searched the woman's pockets, she found one final piece of evidence, a small key that opened a safety deposit box containing the original contracts for Samuel Cole's railroad deals, including the document that had ordered Sarah's murder. The conspiracy was finally over. Sarah Cole would finally have her justice, and Cole Mountain would finally be free of the secrets that had haunted it for more than a century. 6 months later, Abram stood in the Pine Valley Cemetery as they laid Sarah Cole to rest properly for the first time. The headstone was new, carved from mountain granite, and it bore the simple inscription, Sarah Elizabeth Cole, 1882-1889, truth teller, finally at peace. The funeral was attended by hundreds of people, not just from Pine Valley, but from across the country. Historians, journalists, descendants of the victims, and families who had discovered their own ancestors' involvement in the conspiracy had all come to pay their respects to a 7-year-old girl whose courage, in the face of evil, had finally been recognized. Rebecca Henley stood beside Abram as they lowered the small coffin into the ground. She had become the unofficial keeper of Sarah's legacy, establishing a foundation that investigated historical injustices and worked to bring closure to families who had lost loved ones to violence and cover-ups. She would have grown up to be remarkable, Rebecca said softly, placing a bouquet of wildflowers on the grave. Even as a child, she was braver than most. Adults, Dr. Wheeler had spent the months Since the confrontation, cataloging and analyzing all the evidence recovered from the mine and the various hiding places the conspirators had used, his preliminary report had identified 43 victims of the conspiracy spanning nearly a century, and federal investigators were working to notify families and provide proper burials for those whose remains could be recovered. The revelation of the Western land fraud conspiracy had sent shockwaves through academic and legal circles. University history departments were revising textbooks, federal prosecutors were reopening century-old cases, and Congress was debating legislation to provide reparations to the Native American tribes, whose land had been stolen through Samuel Cole's schemes. Doc Henley hadn't lived to see Sarah's proper burial. The stress of finally revealing the truth had proved too much for his aging heart, and he died peacefully in his sleep 2 weeks after the confrontation on the mountain. But his final act had been to sign a confession that detailed his family's role in the cover-up and donated all their assets to funds supporting the victims' families. Pine Valley itself had undergone a transformation that was both painful and necessary. The revelation that much of the town's prosperity had been built on blood money had divided the community, but it had also sparked a remarkable process of reconciliation and renewal. The stolen railroad money was being traced and returned to its rightful owners, while the town was working to build a new economy based on legitimate tourism and sustainable development. Sheriff Brennan had been re-elected by a wide margin after his role in stopping Helen Morrison and exposing the conspiracy became known. His family's historical involvement in the cover-up had initially cost him support, but his choice to stand with justice when it mattered most had earned him the respect of voters who valued integrity over family loyalty. Agent Martinez had been promoted and transferred to head a new federal task force investigating historical crimes and their modern cover-ups. The techniques developed during the Sarah Cole investigation were being applied to similar cases across the country, bringing closure to families who had been denied justice for generations. As the funeral service concluded and the mourners began to disperse, Abram found himself walking with Rye through the cemetery, visiting the graves of his ancestors. His parents' headstone looked the same as always, but somehow the whole family section felt different now that the truth was finally known. He stopped at his grandfather's grave and knelt to place his hand on the weathered stone. The old man had carried the burden of the family secret for decades, and while his actions hadn't been heroic, his final confession had helped make justice possible. "I understand now why you couldn't tell me," Abram said quietly, "but I'm glad the truth came out anyway. Sarah deserved better than silence." Rye had wandered over to a newer section of the cemetery, where a simple marker bore the name Patricia Henley, 1955-1987. She sought truth. Rebecca had arranged for her mother's body to be moved from its original burial site to a place of honor near Sarah's grave, symbolically reuniting the victims of the conspiracy across the generations. The drive back up Coal Mountain took Abram past the site where his cabin had once stood. The federal government had purchased the land to preserve it as a historical site, and construction had begun on a museum that would tell the story of Sarah Cole and the other victims of the conspiracy. The fallen tree had been left where it lay, a monument to the moment when the truth had finally been revealed. Abram's new cabin was smaller than the old one, built near the creek where he and Rye could listen to the water flowing over the stones. The isolation he had once cherished was different now, no longer the solitude of someone hiding from the world, but the peace of someone who had done what needed to be done and could finally rest. The artifacts from Sarah's tree had been preserved in climate-controlled displays at the Smithsonian, where they would help tell the story of Western expansion's hidden costs. But Abram had kept one item, the locket with Sarah's photograph. It sat on his mantle now, a reminder that truth, however long buried, will eventually find its way to the surface. On quiet evenings, as he sat on his porch watching the sunset paint the distant peaks in shades of gold and purple, Abram sometimes felt a presence in the mountain air, not threatening or sad, but peaceful. Sarah Cole was finally free to rest. Her story told, her killers brought to justice. Her courage remembered. The mountains still spoke in groans and winds. But the voices that carried on the air now were those of the living, tourists and historians, and families seeking closure, people who came to learn from the past rather than being haunted by it. Rye had grown grey around the muzzle during their months of testimony and investigation, but he still had the energy to chase rabbits through the meadows and the wisdom to sense when his human needed companionship. On this particular evening, as Abram reflected on all that had changed, the dog came and sat beside his chair, leaning against his leg with the comfortable weight of loyalty freely given. "We did good, didn't we, boy?" Abram said, scratching behind Rye's ears. Sarah can finally rest easy. The dog's tail thumped once against the porch boards, and somewhere in the distance, an owl called from the forest, where ancient pines still stood guard over the mountain's remaining secrets. But these were gentler secrets now, the locations of hidden springs and forgotten trails, the nesting sites of rare birds and the paths of migrating animals. The secrets of violence and greed had been exposed to the light and had withered like poisonous plants pulled from dark soil. In their place, new stories were growing, stories of courage and justice, of people who chose truth over comfort and righteousness over wealth. Coal Mountain was healing, and so was the man who called it home. The past would always be part of the landscape, carved into the stone and preserved in the records, but it no longer cast shadows over the future. Sarah Cole's legacy was not the crime that ended her life, but the justice that finally honored her death. As the stars emerged in the clear mountain sky, Abram Cole sat in peaceful silence with his faithful dog, knowing that some trees fall exactly when they're supposed to, and sometimes the truth waits patiently for the right person to hear it calling through the wind.